Welcome to Democratic Television, a program of the Santa Clara County Democratic Party that brings insights, perspectives, and attitudes of our always thoughtful Democratic guests. Our focus today is on young Democrats, and with us as our guest is Emily Ramos, who's the president of the Silicon Valley Young Democrats. Welcome to the show.
Good to be here.
Thank you for coming. So, Emily, often with our guests, we like to help the Democratic community sort of understand the many different places that our activists kind of come from, what brings them to community life. And so if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about yourself, your background, your family, where you've lived, and where you went to school, things like that.
Okay. So I grew up in Fremont, California. My parents immigrated here from there, immigrated to here from the Philippines before I was born. I since moved to Mountain View, good home of Mountain View.
Wonderful.
And I got involved after the 2012, well, during the 2012 re-election of President Obama. I came in to buy a snapback hat for my baby sister, an Obama snapback hat, and it turns out that the office I went to didn't sell gear, but they somehow roped me into doing a lot of phone calls.
Wow, so you went in to buy a hat for your sister and you ended up being a volunteer for the campaign.
Yeah, pretty much.
Fabulous, very interesting. In Fremont, was your family involved in community life as leaders in the community? Because I know both you and one of your sisters are involved in our local Democratic Party efforts.
Yeah, my parents, interestingly, are not involved in politics at all. They fled the Philippines from a dictatorship, essentially, when out of fear of martial law happening. So when they came here, they didn't really view politics as a thing that they really wanted to go into. Yeah. My older sister was super interested in politics from the moment she was able to speak.
I see.
So it was always understood that politics was going to be her thing, and mine would be tech, my baby sister would be art, and then somehow I went to get an Obama snapback hat for my baby sister, and now they know both of us.
Wow. So it's interesting. I'm curious, how did someone manage to engage you and from such a casual interaction? Did you see something in the office that struck you? Did you have a conversation with someone that inspired you?
Largely, it was a very persistent field director. His name was Brandon Lee. He essentially guilted me. He threw a bunch of numbers about how much phone calls would equal this many votes, and how many votes would it have taken to switch over Al Gore instead of President Bush.
So it made it seem like you were responsible for President Bush.
No, it was just like, if you made this many phone calls, you could prevent the next Bush.
Wow.
And they gave me a slip where I could say when I was available. And I was like, I'm available at this time and this time and this time to make phone calls. And they signed me up for all of them.
Wow, fabulous.
I just didn't want to say no, and so I just showed up every day.
Wow, what a great recruiter of volunteers. I think it sounds like you made a pitch that made you feel like that you should do something, and also that if you did something that it could matter. Wonderful, good. In growing up in Fremont, was your family connected to an immigrant community there, or was your experience, would you say, kind of more typical California?
Not necessarily immigrant community. My entire family seemed to have immigrated along with the rest of my family. My grandparents, they actually first immigrated here, and then one by one they petitioned each of their children to come here.
I see. Yeah.
And there was 13 of them.
So you ended up part of an extended family that had made it to the U.S.
Essentially, so we all lived near each other.
Fabulous.
Whether it was Fremont or Union City or San Leandro.
You mentioned a career in tech. Did you go to a technical training, through a technical schooling?
Yes, I graduated. My college was California Maritime Academy.
Oh, interesting.
And I graduated with mechanical engineering there.
Ah, interesting. I'm also a mechanical engineer. We may have had that connection, made that connection in the past. Did your schooling include any at-sea training or any on-ship training?
Yes,
really?
They required us to go out to sea for, we did 2 student cruises, which we had our own ship called the Golden Bear.
Wow.
Training ship Golden Bear. And it was a twin diesel medium speed engines, and then I had to do a commercial cruise with, I did APL, American Presidential Alliance. They're a cargo container ship.
Wow.
And I was on the APL China.
Wow, interesting. They do kind of long hauls, don't they, when they go all over the world?
72 days.
Wow.
It was supposed to be 70, but then we had some issues in China.
Wow, how interesting. Were there other women serving on the ship that you happened to take your cruise on?
We had one communications officer for the first half, and then after that I was the only woman on the ship.
Wow, how interesting. Well, what an interesting experience. Has that informed your community life, your experience in the Maritime Academy or your training at sea?
It's interesting. In my school, it was actually more red than blue. More so than the rest of the Bay Area. The Bay Area is very famously very deeply blue.
Liberal, right? Yes.
Like if you're not a Democrat, then you're probably like libertarian, not
right.
Republican.
But you found a more conservative setting there at school?
A little bit more. My freshman year, it was 2004 elections, and it was the first time I saw someone cheer that George Bush won.
Wow.
It was the weirdest thing.
Wow. Yes, how interesting. Well, good. And since moving to Mountain View, I know you've been active in a number of things, and including serving as president of the Silicon Valley Young Democrats. What brought you to be involved with that group?
So I remember how there was a field director that was very insistent on volunteering.
Yes.
Afterwards, after the campaign, he chose to run for ADEMS.
Ah, okay.
And it was the first time I've ever heard of anything like ADEMS.
Yes. Explain for viewers what that is. Many will know, but others won't.
Assembly District Election Meeting.
Yes. So he ran to be a delegate to the state convention, the state party.
And he just happened to know that I lived in 8025 at the time. And he's just, those things are just, it's all about turnout. Or
right.
You need
it's
to
a
get
caucus
people,
kind of meeting, right? You get the person who gets bodies to show up will prevail, right?
So I showed up for the first time. That was a little bit more of a controversial ADEM, 8025 back in 2013.
Ah, yes, I remember.
There was the big primary fight between Mike Honda and Ro Khanna.
I see. Yeah,
and that
expressed itself a little bit in that election.
It was very expressive in that ADEMS, and I was wondering, I've never heard of anything like ADEMS. I thought it was a decent Democrat, and then his name was Brandon Lee. He recommended I go to Silicon Valley Young Democrats and learn more about what's going on with the inner workings of the party.
That's interesting. So as an entry point to sort of the party side as opposed to the campaign side, what did you find? What was your experience as a new person first coming to Silicon Valley Young Democrats?
I thought it was a very fun group. They're very supportive. One of the big things was they really wanted to support young people seeking office. I believe in my second meeting, we early endorsed Evan Lowe when he chose to run for assembly.
I see.
And it was at the time a little bit of a rare thing for young people to run for office.
Right.
And I'm happy that like in my time since then, that's not as rare anymore. We've had many young Dems into office. We have not only just Assembly Member Evan Lowe, we endorsed Assembly Member Mark Berman, who got into office, Corey Wolbach, and we had a lot of other young Dems run for office. Oh, Anthony Phan and Milpitas.
So a lot of members and other young Democrats supported by the club have been successful in recent election cycles. So that's very interesting. What sort of things do the Young Democrats do? You mentioned they're very supportive, especially of young Democrat candidates. What sort of support do they provide? So
we're known as the army of people who knock on doors.
Ah, good.
We, being young and not exactly set in our careers, we do what we have a lot of time, not a lot of money.
Right, more time than money.
So we do a lot of invasions and a lot of knocking on doors for local candidates.
And what would an invasion entail? What would that be like?
An invasion is actually a grouping with other Young Dem clubs. So we do some partnerships. I think the biggest partnership we have is usually with Peninsula Young Democrats.
I see.
And they're a little bit up north. We actually share the Mountain View, Palo Alto, and maybe Sunnyvale area with them, sometimes Santa Clara too. And then there's also South Alameda County Young Democrats who, by the sound, Southern Alameda County.
Yeah, so they kind of touch on our county on that end. Are you, so the invasion then is sort of a coordinated effort. You sort of leverage your own volunteers by coordinating with other clubs. That's an interesting approach. Well, good. And so in the time that you've been in the club, obviously you've kind of come to be the club president. How did you decide to get involved in leadership, and how did that come about?
I just wanted to be able to put in the time to make the club better. And so that's why I initially was club secretary, and then I eventually became membership director, and then president after that.
What advice would you have for club officers, not just the Young Democrats, but club officers generally? Like, what things have you found that have worked to help to grow the club or make it be more active or successful?
You get out what you put in. There's a lot of energy right now. It seems like a lot of energy happens after a presidential election, no matter what it was, because I joined after President Obama's re-election.
It's very common.
And there was a lot of energy, and now that we have this dumpster fire in Washington, D.C., there's a lot of energy now there.
Right.
You get what you put in, but it multiplies. So there's a lot of organizational work that is required for these clubs, and a lot of adherence to bylaws, a lot of adherence to rules and regulations. My advice is to know them, learn them, and reach out to people. And all these organizations are usually run by volunteers, so patience is a virtue.
Right. Yes, you have to remember at all times that people aren't being paid for what they do. I think that's good advice, and generally it's helpful for club officers to sort of sort that out and understand the rules and make that work so that other people can volunteer and focus on the activities that they like to do. Well, we're on the subject of getting involved. How would a young person in the area get involved in the Silicon Valley Young Democrats? What would you suggest? Kind of attending an event or a meeting?
So our meetings are open to pretty much anyone. You don't actually have to be a Young Democrat to show up in a meeting. You have to be a Young Democrat in order to vote on things, and you have to show up to about 3 meetings before you can vote. Well, 3 meetings including that current meeting, to be allowed to vote on things and pay your dues.
I see.
These are important.
Yes.
But all our meetings are open to the public. You don't actually have to be young. You could be older.
Older, right? You have allies as well.
Yes, you could be young at heart.
We'll come back at the end of the show as well to do contact information. But if you wanted to find out about an event, where would someone look in the public?
You would go to our website or our Facebook page.
Okay, which is the website address?
The website is svyd.org.
svyd.org, so Silicon Valley Young Democrats, svyd.org. Fabulous. Wonderful. Well, it's been great talking to you so far in this conversation. We'll come back in the second half and continue our conversation about the Young Democrats and some of your other community involvement. So thank you very much, and we'll be ready to resume our conversation in just a moment. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Jerry McNerney. I'm the newest elected member of the United States Congress from Northern California. I represent the 11th Congressional District. I got involved in politics because my son encouraged me to do so. I'd never thought about doing that before in my life. And here I am now in Congress helping to change the direction of our country. If you would like to get involved in your country, we need you, we need your help, the community needs you. Please contact your local Democratic Party at 408-445-9500 and help make a difference. Thank you.
So we're back with our guest, Emily Ramos, the president of the Silicon Valley Young Democrats. Emily, I wanted to ask you a bit. I want you to represent the entire millennial generation for a moment. No, really seriously, speaking for yourself as a young person, what are some of the issues? We currently have the Trump administration in D.C., and that's been a cause of great concern among Democrats and among Americans generally. But are there things that you feel that millennials or that young Democrats are particularly worried about in the current environment?
So interestingly enough, this hasn't really changed. This issue has not changed that much with the new presidential administration. One of the largest issues that millennials need to deal with right now is housing in this area. We actually chose to vote on making this our issue of emphasis this year.
I see.
And where all our speakers are focused on that issue. Past speakers, we had Sue Russell from the League of Women Voters Housing Committee speak to our club about housing. One of our upcoming meetings will have Evan Ortiz from the Mountain View Tennis Coalition talking about rent stabilization. And that is the primary issue that a lot of members of our club and people of our generation are facing with the high housing costs, the lack of affordable housing, the lack of housing in general that makes essentially it naturally affordable. I'm sure the new administration doesn't help with the uncertainty of the federal grants and funding for affordable housing.
So it sounds like that local young Democrats remain focused on the issues and challenges that young people in the area are facing in terms of the affordability of living in the area and things of that nature.
Yes.
Are there things, what sort of solutions do young Democrats advocate for in that realm? What kind of candidates are inspiring to them in terms of addressing the housing issue locally?
So I like to think of it as the 3 levels of issue solving. There's the short term, medium term, long term. Short term, we are looking at rent stabilization, which was just recently put in place in Mountain View. Medium term is subsidized units, government affordable housing, and then a long-term solution is market supply. So those are the types of solutions we are looking at now. We haven't chose what we would emphasize more on. I believe that would come as a needed basis, whether there is we're partnering up with Catalyze Silicon Valley, or Catalyze SV, and they are pushing for more housing in the West San Jose, Santa Clara area. We are supporting a lot of, we are encouraging our members to go to planning commissions and speak in favor of housing, going to city council meetings and speaking in favor of housing. And that's largely where our advocacy is going.
It sounds like it's a multi-pronged approach, yes. Increasing the supply for the long-term solution and trying to address the immediate affordability problem as well for the benefit of young people. Those issues, I know, among Democrats can sometimes not be contentious, but people can have differing views. In some cases, developments that would create more housing get opposition either because people are concerned about the environment or the transportation and other infrastructure impact. How do you feel like those concerns should be balanced against the need for more housing and more affordable housing in the area?
I feel that we are pushing largely for more housing. We have a lot of members that actually are focused on land use designations and land use, transportation planning, and seeing that as a whole, full synergy.
Yeah, kind of a comprehensive solution that addresses all the different aspects of it.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's why we do focus on getting speakers that are experts in housing, because a lot of members, there are a lot of members that are really good experts at it, and then there are a lot of members who joined after what the heck happened in Washington, D.C., but they all know that housing is such a serious issue here, and the question is how to solve it. And quite honestly, not a lot of people have there are a lot of different solutions out there. There's no exact one super solution, and so we have to learn about all those solutions that are possible, what it comes down to, like what are the negatives for what are the impacts of those solutions, and then balance those out.
I see. I know that you mentioned the rent stabilization in Mountain View, and that's a recent development.
Yes.
Did you have some personal involvement in that effort as a Mountain View resident?
So Young Dems, we volunteer for a lot of campaigns. I actually volunteered very heavily in a council campaign here in Mountain View.
I see.
And that candidate supported Measure V, and so there was a lot of support going that way.
I see.
And a lot of people who supported the same things we were dealing a lot with.
What does the rent stabilization entail? And often in the kind of the mainstream media, one hears the idea of rent control expressed in a way that makes it seem like an old idea or maybe a radical idea. Is rent stabilization something slightly different? And it's interesting to me that it's emerging again as a solution in our high cost area.
So when a lot of people think rent control, there's rent control, rent stabilization, rent regulation. when they think rent control, they think the New York style rent control where your landlord, you are not allowed to raise your rent at all, or like this is the rent that you have to set.
I see.
In California, we have a law called Costa-Hawkins, where it limits that you cannot actually tell someone that like you have to set the rent this, but it says that you could set it by a percentage every year.
I see.
So like a landlord cannot
rate
raise.
limiter.
Yes. Landlord cannot raise your rent, and it also exempts certain units, single-family homes built before 1995, and that was to discourage fear of building new units, because that was one of the big arguments against rent stabilization, is that, oh, if you do rent stabilization, no one's going to want to build anymore, but new units are essentially exempt. In Mountain View, it was Mountain View, Burlingame, and San Mateo. They all had measures on the ballot this year. I believe also Richmond and Alameda also.
I see. Were they all successful as Mountain View or no?
Mountain View, I believe, was the only successful one in the peninsula.
I see.
Unfortunately, San Mateo and Burlingame did not go through. But Mountain View is not the only rent-stabilized city in the peninsula. East Palo Alto had their program for 30 years. A lot of cities, actually most cities, had theirs for around 30 years. So at some point 30 years ago, a bunch of rent stabilization ordinance came into effect. It seems to be a growing wave with how bad the housing crunch is right now.
I see.
So rumors
So the
are
experience of
Pacifica.
those cities that have, did it 30 years ago must have been studied as an example. Did that
Yes.
come up in the campaign in Mountain View? Question comparisons and analyses of what happened and the impact of rent stabilization in those communities that had done it so long ago.
The joy of being very proud of your city is always believing that your city is completely unique.
Right. Yes.
So sometimes people look at like East Palo Alto, Mountain View is not East Palo Alto.
Right.
So the question is, why would you compare them? Mountain View is not West Hollywood. Mountain View is not, or the other one, Santa Monica.
Well, did those other communities generally have a positive experience with rent stabilization? Did all the developers stopped building there, or was it mostly a positive experience?
I mean, I'm pretty sure they're still developing in East Palo
Yeah,
Alto.
right.
I think they just built the new Amazon campus.
Yes. It didn't become. It wasn't the end of the world for them.
No, not really.
Interesting. So now is the you've recently been appointed to a rental committee. Can you tell me the correct title of the committee?
Oh, okay. So when Measure V passed, it set up, its a formal name is the Community Stabilization and Fair Rent Act. And one of the provisions of that act is the creation of a committee called the Rental Housing Committee.
I see.
That committee is appointed by City Council to essentially implement the rent stabilization program. It's a 5-member committee plus an alternate, and I was recently appointed to it.
Fabulous! Congratulations.
Thank you.
That's great. What kind of who's on the board? I mean, who's on the committee? Did the measure specify the kinds of people who could be appointed, or did the city council decide?
The city council were the people who appointed the members, and the law stipulated that you could not have more than 2 people who was either a landlord, a property manager, a developer, or a real estate agent
I see.
be on that committee. So no more than 2. We currently have 2. We have 1 landlord and 1 property manager.
I see. It sounds like a big job. Is it meant to resolve disputes, or help the city council set policy, or help the city enforce the requirements, or all of the above?
All of the above, but it's also, because we are the first committee, there's a lot of setup and implementation to do. We had votes on like our code of conduct. We had to decide who our chair. We had to decide our process and how we pick our chair. We had to decide on essentially what we call the petition process. So if someone would petition to the rental housing committee to either raise their rents, lower their rents, evict. There's a various reasons why you would submit a petition. We had to figure that out. We had to figure out the petition process. One of the biggest things is something called fair rate of return. That this came after a case, the Fisher versus the City of Berkeley, where Berkeley had a rent control ordinance that got shot down because the judge said that the landlord had a right to a fair rate of return, and so they updated the ordinance to come up with a standard of a fair rate of return. We now have to create our own standard of that in Mountain View.
I see. So it sounds like quite a bit of setting up both substantive rules and procedures.
Think of it as clarifying the measure.
Right, yes. Yeah, and I guess that's always the case. There's always some implementation that's required. Well, that's very fascinating. I want to come back to the national picture. I understand that the Silicon Valley Young Democrats are focusing on this local issue of housing. In your experience, have many members become active in these resistance groups? There's a lot of organic groups that have popped up to try to oppose the Trump agenda and kind of speak up for democratic values on the national level. Have many young Democrats gotten involved in those groups, and if so, what has resonated with them, and if not, well, why would you say maybe not?
So what the good news about these resistance groups is that they are people coming together after waking up at the dumpster fire that is Washington, D.C.
Right.
And realizing that they need to get involved. Now, if they happen to be a certain age range, which is the 14 to 35, they also look up that and see that there's a Young Democrats group. So.
Have you had new members, show up kind of in response?
Yeah.
You have.
We had
fabulous.
a large amount of new members show up after the election because they were just like, I didn't want to be involved, but now I don't think I can legitimately not be involved.
I see. Well, don't forget Brandon Lee's example and make sure they all get signed up to volunteer.
Guilt them into it.
Yes, exactly. Get them to step forward and help us in our fights. I should have mentioned earlier, you're also a member of our Democratic Central Committee. Congratulations. I know you've been appointed relatively recently, and we're glad to have young Democrat voices on our Central Committee. Well, it's been fabulous having this conversation with you. I appreciate your coming and being on the show, and best of luck in your work. If I remember, it's svyd.org is the website to find your events. And if someone wanted to email your executive board, how would they do that?
Oh, it would just simply be eboard@svyd.org, and it gets sent to all our eBoard members.
Very good. Easy for people to communicate with you. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for watching DTV. Give us a call at 408-445-9500 or visit our website at www.sccdp.org. Help us to make a difference. We'll see you on the campaign trail.